Oh look, a police box! God yes, I can hide from the mind-shattering aliens that have invaded Earth for the 7th time, and the overwhelming, crushing anxiety from the world as a whole. Hello? Thought this was a police box, but oh wait, this has to be a TARDIS, right? Oh yeah, well, I'm just gonna run home and get my things. I will be right back. Oh, fuck. Okay, gonna run home and hide and watch Doctor Who then? Yeah, that sounds like the plan. Okay, well that gets up and running and we hide from the invading aliens and the overwhelming anxiety of the world as a whole. Let's actually break down what we're going to be doing here. We are breaking down a bunch of questions that people have asked ahead of time to understand Doctor Who's first Doctor. I'd love this to not just be me talking into the open air. The questions are laid out in the description so they can easily be copied and replied to in the comments, in shorts, at home privately, in a journal, or among friends, if that is where you feel most comfortable. This is definitely not a retrospective, and it is certainly not meant to be a review or some in-depth critique of the character. This is ultimately supposed to be a thing about figuring out what the first Doctor from BBC's seminal series Doctor Who and all of his adventures through time and space mean to everyone, really.
Quite the strength of character, this incarnation.
How would you describe the first Doctor to someone who has never heard of the concept? We covered what Doctor Who as a whole means to us all the way back in the very first video we made specifically for this channel. In that very rough video, we went over what the franchise was as a whole, so I'm not really going to do that here, focusing more on what makes the first Doctor stand out amongst all of his incarnations. But super quick, just in case, Doctor Who is a series about an alien that basically looks human and is immortal by means of being able to change his face whenever he is near death.
Looks like a senile old man, but he's tough. Tough and wiry like an old turkey.
The series follows his adventures through time and space in his science fiction ship, the TARDIS, with a crew of revolving human companions. Obviously, there is that moniker. This was the first iteration of the character, and while in canon it might not be his first regeneration, that big, ever-important digit number 1 has stuck with this specific iteration. The character was pretty much always perceived as an older man when Doctor Who was pitched as a series, and the series producer pushed to hire William Hartnell, who at this point was already a staple of British television. They paired Hartnell with 3 far younger actors, essentially with the idea that he would add the gravitas, the wisdom, and the initial means of starting the adventure, while the younger leads would more or less take on the lifting from an action perspective and really push the plot and change on the Doctor's part forward.
Emotions, love, pride, hate, fear. Have you no emotions, sir?
Early on, especially in the first story, Hartnell's Doctor was portrayed as being particularly crotchety and almost aggressive, between trying to leave most of his companions behind and trying to turn a caveman skull into a drinking bowl with a large rock. I would say this changed pretty soon into the series' second season after Carol Ann Ford, who played his granddaughter Susan in the series, left the show. Whether it was on the side of the crew of the writers, directors, or producers who pushed the change, I am unsure, but I personally largely attribute it to Hartnell making deliberate decisions, seeing that his character would be a mainstay while the rest of the cast would quickly become more rotational, with the characters of Ian and Barbara leaving soon after Susan, and a more streamlined crew of characters with Vicky and Stephen for a hot minute before the doors really started metaphorically revolving.
Well, what does this do? That is the dematerializing control, and that over yonder is the horizontal hold. Up there is the scanner, those are the doors, that is a chair with a panda on it. Sheer poetry, dear boy. Now please stop bothering me.
The Doctor was starting to loosen up before when it came to making jokes or poking fun at the ever-changing cast of villains, as well as softening up more around his companions, but never lost his stern reputation, partially because the series cast the Doctor as an old grandfatherly type, and thus hired an old man in the part. Hartnell was 55 when he took the role, which probably felt more like 75 today. So within 3 years, the actor's health was failing him in such a way that it began to make filming the series a detriment. I'm confident it was begrudgingly, but it was Hartnell himself partially who stepped away from the role, and I'm not sure if he imagined the series would conclude with his exit or not, but producers saw the potential in the series and wrote a way for the character to continue with a new actor.
His face, his hair, look at it!
He's breathing.
The character would return a few times. Since the series delves with time travel, we can meet past versions of yourself in really interesting ways, you know. Hartnell himself would return as the character on screen just one more time for the 3 Doctors special, but was ultimately recast for the 5 Doctors, and again decades later when the franchise would be revived in the new millennium. Like all the Doctors, The Good First has also had a long life in print and audio-exclusive adventures that I have not had a chance to delve into in depth myself, but if you have a favorite non-TV First Doctor adventure, then please, please, please let me know what it is so I can check it out.
No, yes.
Curiosity that leads him on adventure after adventure. But no one ever seems to know his name.
Even some of the things Dr. Foreman said.
That's not his name. Who is he? Doctor Who?
Enjoy the original Doctor Who in its original black and white. No artificial coloring. Today at 4, here on Channel 33. How were you introduced to the first Doctor? We talked about how we were introduced to Doctor Who as a whole already. A friend and co-worker introduced me to the 9th, and from there I was pretty hooked on the modern series. At that time, the only access I had to the classic series was through whatever Netflix had, which was not a lot. Netflix presented a single adventure from each Doctor, and for the first Doctor, the adventure they gave us was the Aztecs. Honestly, a really good story for the first Doctor in a vacuum. While I had a little trouble caring about everyone and everything going on in that early episode, going back after watching the first Doctor's run in its entirety, I definitely understand why it was selected over something like An Unearthly Child.
I knew something like this would happen. We stayed in one place too long.
Although I do believe the Daleks is maybe the best introduction to the first Doctor you could have had pushed if you had to only push one adventure. Oh, and Netflix also pushed the 3 Doctors as the third Doctor's adventure. Again, not the best introduction for 3, and you don't get a ton of 1 in that one, but I understand why it was the third Doctor adventure they presented in a void. I did get access to the Doctor Who Classic series in its entirety a few years later. At that time, I think I had maybe also watched the 8th Doctor's movie on YouTube. I watched An Unearthly Child, the first of the first adventures as far as televised Doctor Who is concerned. I watched The Daleks, the next adventure, then realized a large portion of the first Doctor's episode library is missing and didn't have the patience at the time, so I skipped all the way to the second Doctor's final serial because it was at the time the earliest point you could start watching without missing an episode. I know, fake fan. So the first and second Doctor were actually the final Doctors I ultimately watched in their entirety, but I did go back and watched all of their runs using either telesnaps, reconstructions, or animated episodes, and then watched everything again for this video. And if you were more interested in a breakdown of all of those first Doctor adventures, adventure by adventure, I am doing a breakdown of every televised serial in 2 weeks. So please do what you need to do to be updated for that.
Our destiny is in the stars, so let's go and search for it.
If you could meet any first Doctor companion, who would it be? We could do an entire video on companions or just about each Doctor, honestly, but that would take way more time and energy than is feasible for me on my own at this point in time. At the same time, it would feel really wrong to not talk about the Doctor's companions at all, so we are dedicating this question to them. Way down the line when the Doctor only rocks one companion all season, this question isn't going to be very relevant, so let's savor it while we can.
A Peri is a good and beautiful fairy in Persian mythology. The interesting thing is, before it became good, it was evil. And that's what you are. Thoroughly evil.
Full stop. Susan was probably my favorite companion of all the first Doctor's run. She is interesting and witty when she is not being shoehorned into the damsel role. Carol Ann Ford is an amazing actress, and the character has a great arc about learning to both assist and ultimately step away from her grandfather. Nope, sorry. He takes that last choice away from her. But Susan is still a great character, and also not the person I would enjoy most having a conversation with. I talked about this with Tony Stark in the last video we did on Marvel, but I both do not think I could keep up with Susan in a super meaningful way that she would be able to engage with, nor do I have any questions for her that I think she would actually want or be able to answer.
Yes, what's happening here?
Nah, let me sit down and pick the brain of Katarina, the first companion to die on screen, the handmaiden that the Doctor and Steven saved from the sacking of Troy in the serial The Mythmakers. Then immediately let her fly out of an airlock in the following story, The Daleks' Master Plan. We weren't really being cheeky with the TARDIS yet. Sorry, Katarina. Assuming we were within the TARDIS's sphere of influence so we can actually communicate with each other, I would absolutely love to just pick her mind about her mentality, really, and the everyday life of Bronze Age Greece. There is so much we still don't know from that area and that period in general. I also just find her character super interesting as a whole in the way that she worships the Doctor as a deity, and that is such an interesting concept that we never explore again in the series.
Now listen to me, son. You're in the army now, and you've gone and put your name down on sick report. So you have to report sick, see? You can't go changing your mind in the army. Now answer me a question. I'm not human, am I?
No, Sergeant. Yes, Sergeant.
You'd be surprised to learn that I've got a wife and kid, wouldn't you?
What are the themes of the first Doctor's run? There were so many people behind the scenes that had a hand in making Doctor Who, less so like modern Who showrunner position, or even the long-term producers classic Who would get later like Jonathan Nathan Turner. Early Who definitely felt like the writers could push just about any script they wanted without much oversight, especially if people were in a crunch, which feels like it was pretty much a constant in a weekly televised series from the 60s. So while there are definitely some themes in each individual serial, there's definitely less so of an overarching theme to the entire run or even a season.
Possibly one day in the future, when you've learnt your lesson, I shall return and release you. Release me? Me?
The closest thing I think you could get to a consistent theme early on in the series is the emphasis on the soap operatized edutainment. It is no secret that the series was created with the directive to push themes of science in episodes that took place in the future, and to push themes of history in episodes that took place in the past. That's why we have a history teacher and a math teacher in the TARDIS to literally teach the audience about both topics. When Ian and Barbara are a part of the TARDIS, the Doctor is distinctly less active of a character to give them space to fulfill their purpose. But pretty soon after they leave, we just let the Doctor fill both those functions, while the companions the rest of his run would almost solely act as the adventurer and damsel archetypes instead, albeit fun and witty archetypes.
I shall try not to kill you. I shall aim for your arm.
How well it succeeded in pushing these themes is definitely another matter. Almost immediately after the first Doctor's regeneration, we would abandon the premise of historical episodes almost entirely until the rise of the pseudo-historical with the Third Doctor and the Time Warrior. The historical episodes were consistently the lowest performing rating-wise, so it makes sense from a producer or executive's perspective why they were cut for the higher performing science-based episodes in a science fiction series, which is a little sad because I find the historical episodes to be some of the best written episodes, especially for the first Doctor. The Crusades is an amazing piece of Shakespearean writing.
Understand this. This woman can rot in one of Saladin's prisons until her hair turns white before I'll trade with the man that killed my friends.
And the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve was particularly impactful and insightful on a personal level.
Stephen? Vicky? Is that you? Oh.
Which is your favorite actor to play the first Doctor? The first Doctor is unique in that, at the time of recording, he's the only Doctor to have multiple actors play an iteration of the character on screen. Yes, just about every Doctor whose actor has retired from acting has also had at least one performer do a pretty fantastic voice imitation for audio stories and radio plays, but as far as I am aware, only the first Doctor has had multiple actors on screen in canon appearances. Which does mean that, yes, Peter Cushing's Doctor is excluded from this question on the parameters I have set for myself. Since that version of the character is just human, and despite using a lot of the same script and dialogue in his movies from the series, he manages to portray the Doctor very differently from William Hartnell. Who, yes, William Hartnell is the very clear choice for a favorite. He was in large part responsible for the fan response being as big as it was for Doctor Who when it debuted. Yes, Hartnell wouldn't have been anywhere without Variety Lambert and the rest of the staff, but the fans, and especially children, latched onto Hartnell's grandfatherly portrayal of the character. He also had the most time to play the character, not leaving much room for either Richard Hurdenall or David Bradley to stand out, besides doing their best Hartnell impressions.
Good grief.
I do believe David Bradley brings so much to his portrayal of Hartnell himself in the BBC biopic An Adventure in Space and Time, which follows the creation of Doctor Who through the first regeneration from the actor and producer's perspectives.
A Merry Christmas to all of you at home.
What do you think made Doctor Who so successful early on? We just mentioned British children especially latching onto William Hartnell's grandfatherly-like portrayal of the Time Lord, but Hartnell cannot take sole responsibility for the series' success. Nor can the Daleks, who became the merchandising face of the franchise in large part thanks to the estate of Terry Nation. Both eccentric old men like the Doctor, and in the words of Sidney Newman, who pitched the series, bug-eyed monsters like the Daleks had been seen in popular science fiction before.
Now listen to me, young man. Sit down.
I don't have any data behind my theories revolving Doctor Who's success, but if I had to guess, science fiction as a genre was just coming down from a huge spike in popularity in the 50s from science fiction horror and kaiju movies. But in my experience, the genre doesn't really just lose its audience as quick as sci-fi did in the 60s, it just switches mediums. In this case, to television, where the lower budgets kind of forced an awful kind of crunched creativity that led to a lot more introspective science fiction stories like 1959's The Twilight Zone.
A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind.
Judging from virtually every person's reaction when they first see the Daleks, usually something along the lines of, "Oh, how dangerous can this trash can with a whisk be?" And comparing it to how most people view the space Nazis after just one or two stories involving the creatures, is my prime evidence for this idea. The design is very goofy on the outside, a lot like the series concept as a whole, but the writing and those deeper themes are what consistently stick in the minds of audiences. The episodes that explore these themes are definitely the ones that have continued to stand out more so than the others throughout the decades.
I am the new Remington electric shaver. Twist my dial and I will obey you. At 1, I am gentle. At 2 and 3, I grow fiercer. At 4, I will annihilate the toughest whisker. 5 is for sideboards. 6 is for cleaning me. Thank you.
How do you feel the first Doctor has influenced culture? I mean, outside of launching the longest-running science fiction series in the history of television, going 30 seasons strong at the time of recording if you count the revival series as a continuation, what was brought into the popular culture from the first Doctor's run specifically, though, is a little harder to figure out than you might imagine.
What you need is a jolly good smack bottom. Come on.
A lot of the mannerisms we think of when we think of how the Doctor should act comes from a combination of his next 3 iterations, I believe. The first Doctor introduced fans to the idea of Doctor Who in a lot of ways, while the second, third, and fourth Doctors tried to introduce us more to the character and the universe as a whole. Part of this is because of that grandfatherly portrayal, I think. It may have made the character a little more untouchable on a personal level if Hartnell wanted to portray a more general wisdom.
But don't call me Doc. Now, do I make myself clear?
Yes, whatever you say, Doc. Talk.
The two main things from the first Doctor's run that have stuck in the popular conscious of the series are the TARDIS itself, the big blue police box that was only phased out once briefly in the franchise's history and then was immediately brought back because it was so iconic, to the point where the BBC now owns the right to the trademark on the general design and the color it's painted with. The other big takeaway from this era would be its villains. The Daleks alone have become one of the most iconic elements of science fiction. I have a whole documentary called Dalek Mania surrounding the merchandising boom the alien Nazis had in the 60s. Currently, every iteration of the Doctor has faced the menace in some form except 15. Wait, I don't think 14 got to either in his 3 special stints, before the Toymaker played a little too hard.
I offer you power. Power to corrupt, to destroy. Think of the exhilaration of that power.
Do you believe the first Doctor is misogynistic? Oof, okay, heavy question here. Honestly, I would say yes, at least partially.
The children of my civilization would be insulted.
I really want to believe the character comes off this way because he was given a granddaughter instead of a grandson, and that granddaughter was cast as old as Carol Ann Ford was at the time. That is immediately going to put a parental figure in a slightly more awkward position because this is naturally when she would want more independence. Susan set a precedent for the Doctor's primary companion being a contemporary young woman, and the writers for the first Doctor continued to write him as a parent instead of a mentor or a friend.
Oh, all right.
It's really interesting.
I would like to believe that if Susan was written as a boy, that the Doctor would have largely treated both characters the same. That or age Susan down by a few years like they did in the film adaptations of the Daleks and the Daleks' Invasion of Earth. Peter Cushing's Doctor comes off as significantly softer, in part because he acts like he's talking to a child while actually talking to a child instead of a teenager like Carol Ann Ford's Susan.
More to the point, what are you young people doing inside my TARDIS?
At the same time, yeah, how the Doctor treats both Susan and Barbara early on in the series is pretty terrible, and Galaxy 4 is maybe my least favorite story in the entire series. Unless I read the subtext wrong, the story is explicitly anti-feminism in a way that I think is very harmful. There's a vague disdain or embarrassment that the 12th Doctor has for one when they bump into each other in Twice Upon a Time, for one pretty accurately acting like he treated Susan early on in the series. But I do think a lot of this was dialed back towards the end of Hartnell's run. Especially by the time Ben and Polly joined the TARDIS, the character had grown significantly. For me, a lot of that growth and how the character would be portrayed almost immediately after does a lot to make me forgive the series for dialing in the character.
That ship of his is in dire need of a good spring clean.
No, stop. Look at the astral map here. Look at all the lovely blinking lights. Look at that.
If you could save any of the missing First Doctor stories in its entirety, which would you choose? We talked about it very briefly earlier. During the very early days of Doctor Who, the idea of reruns or home media was such a foreign concept that the BBC did not have the foresight to preserve nearly any of the early episodes. In fact, they actively taped over many of the episodes as a cost-cutting measure to reuse the tapes. It's only thanks to fans who recorded the series off of their televisions or exported copies of the episodes sent to foreign territories that were kept illegally that we have as much of the first Doctor's run available as we do. The episodes that are still missing have largely been supplemented with animation sequence to the original audio, which has largely remained intact. So, in this theoretical question, those animated episodes are still on the table, but spoilers, I'm not going to be talking about any of those.
Unless this whole body of mine is wearing a bit thin.
I really would want to see the overly robust Daleks master plan because of both the significance of the first companion death in Katarina or Nicholas Courtney's first appearance in the series, who we would see much more of later on in another role. But that's also not my first choice. That would be the Mythmakers.
I explained this to the old man, the doctor.
Not that it's factoring into this question, but it is one of the serials that is still completely lost and does not yet have an animated adaptation. The reason this is my holy grail of Lost Doctor Who episodes, though, is not because of the introduction of Katarina, or it being the last main appearance of Vicky. I just genuinely love how this story is written and how it handles Greek mythology. All the characters that come from the time period are written in a very unique way that I wish we would see more of, where some earnestly believe in the gods and see the Doctor as one, and others more immediately see through the Doctor's guise and the idea of deities as a whole. If you find yourself wanting to try and tackle one of the stories that is still largely missing, or existing primarily in audio format, this would absolutely be the one I would push.
There they sit, secure behind their walls, whilst we rot in their summers and starve in their crack-bone winters.
What does the First Doctor mean to you?
Hi, so Kasey James here editing with a very bad sinus infection, but while I was putting this together, I got a quote from a very great YouTube creator, Clever Who Take Films, who I'm going to be talking about more next week. So before we go into this next question, let's first hear about what Doctor Who means to the people over there, so thank you so much.
I love all of Doctor Who, not only for its story, themes and characters, but because its longevity provides an excellent case study of the history of television production. Whilst I grew up watching several TV series and films, many of which were science fiction or fantasy, Doctor Who was the one that fascinated and inspired me the most because the visual seams constantly reminded me that this was a program that was actually made by someone, rather than a photorealistic representation of the imagination. For most of its early years, however, it was at the cutting edge of technical innovation. Sidney Newman oversaw its initial production. Hailing from Canada, he was very much an outsider to the established old guard of BBC executives that had spent the previous decade essentially bringing theatre rather than cinema to people's living rooms. Bringing his transatlantic experience and novel approach to drama production, Newman shook up the stagnating status quo at the corporation. Assembling a core team of young and enthusiastic creators like Verity Lambert, David Whittaker and Waris Hussein ensured that a pioneering and experimental spirit imbued the nascent programme. Aside from some short-lived yet influential serials like Quatermass and Pathfinders, science fiction was a genre that was very much a stranger to the British television public. No one really knew how to realise such fantastical fare on a minimal budget in front of a multi-camera setup, filmed essentially as live. Not only that, but to do so every Friday evening for over 40 weeks a year. The early years of Doctor Who are therefore marked by an experimentalism and frontier spirit that was never as markedly apparent in later seasons. It pioneered many techniques and processes, which we now take for granted, not only in storytelling, but in both visual and oral inventiveness, as the production team conjured ways of realising the Doctor's travels and travails with barely suitable studio facilities and analogue equipment, sometimes customised and kit-bashed for the occasion. From the howl-round special effect that is the opening sequence, to the bizarre electronic theme tune, to the early eschewing of conventional realisations of monsters and alien antagonists, this programme looked and sounded like nothing else on television. For 25 minutes on a Saturday early evening, a magical combination of visual effects, electronic music, and unfettered imagination was sandwiched between mundane sporting news and light entertainment, and transported millions of young people and their families to unearthly vistas and distant time periods. Whilst these aspects still exist in the programme today, it's important to remember that the programme now exists in a different landscape, rubbing shoulders with countless sci-fi and fantasy offerings all vying for our attention. In 1963, there really was nothing else like it, and it's still thrilling to be returned to that time when rewatching it now. Even just a few years down the line, by the time of the second Doctor, the programme began to settle into a familiar pattern, a formula of bases under siege and malevolent monsters modelled on the early success of the Daleks. This formula can proudly stand in its allotted place, but in the First Doctor's era we have a smorgasbord of variety, from meditations on the misuse of technology to topical, horrifying, irradiated post-apocalyptic wastelands, from the mountains and plains of 13th century China to the acid seas of a distant planet. Along the way we experience drama, horror, farcical comedy, and even a bit of musical theatre. It didn't always work. I still can't sit through The Web Planet and endure its Vaseline-smeared composition of bipedal ants and cuddly mothmen for the full 6 episodes, but I love that it exists nevertheless. Such bold, fearless experimentalism helped to shape and define the limits of the programme, pointing the way forward whilst providing ambitious examples for later programme makers to incorporate and refine. These early years are key to the genetic code of the series, a number of mutant strains, offshoots of potentiality that subsequent producers and showrunners could shape into the programme as it is today. Without such ambition, such successes and noble failures, it's unlikely the story would have lasted as long as it has. It's this endless experimentalism and ambition that I find so endearing and admirable about this era, and why, if ever I need a bit of inspiration, a trip with the First Doctor and his companions is never far from the DVD player.
We talked about how my complete experience with the First Doctor happened from taking the long way round.
Tell him I came the long way round.
I think that largely gave me a vastly different opinion and experience with the character compared to those who did grow up with Hartnell being their Doctor, or the many people who I assume started the classic series from the beginning and maybe just skipped the missing episodes. That is essentially what is available on Tubi currently where I live. I also believe it wasn't until after I watched An Adventure in Space and Time that I watched the First Doctor's run straight through, and that can absolutely change your perspective of the First Doctor. Right now, as it stands, he is nowhere near the top of my personal Doctor's tier list.
To take them away to the security kitchen.
But he is also not at the bottom. Not anymore, anyway.
I wonder. I wonder.
I have so much more respect for both the character and these early serials. I wouldn't say necessarily all of them are the highest in quality. It was essentially ran like a weekly science fiction soap opera at the time, but the people who put it together put everything they had into it. They just weren't given a lot from the studio back then.
Well, you're obviously one of the more determined of us.
But that is what the First Doctor means to me, I suppose. I do earnestly want to know what the character similarly means to you, and thank you for sitting with me this whole time. It does mean a lot to me to have you with me on this adventure of self-discovery. I do earnestly hope it helps others understand the importance of the things in their life as well. I'm going to list off some topics we are going to be doing videos like this on in the future, so if you have any questions you want in the discussion, please say for which topic, and the question will most certainly be discussed. And while those list off, I'm just going to bop outside and see if the coast is clear, eh? Upcoming episodes on, and accepting questions for, Godzilla's Showa era in January, The Venture Brothers in February, Disney's Golden Age in March, Samurai Jack in April, and Books in May. Okay, looks like it's all clear out there. Again, the Friday after next, I am uploading a little marathon talkathon video I made going over every televised adventure of the First Doctor, plus the Peter Cushing movies, so I hope that is appreciated on your end. But it's time for me to go out and try to find that TARDIS again. Please go out and be someone that would make the Doctor proud. You are so much stronger than you think you are.